An old family picture from 1890. A simple frame of wood, a faded date, and a secret that waited more than a century to be seen. Imagine this with me for a moment. Rebecca Martinez had spent over 20 years wandering through forgotten attics and shuttered parlors, searching for relics of the past. Estate sales were her quiet obsession, each one a chance to step through a door left open by time. But the day she entered the Whitmore estate in Salem, Massachusetts, something felt different. The air inside the Victorian mansion was heavy, like a room holding its breath. The house had been sealed for decades, locked after the last member of the Whitmore family died without heirs. Dust lay thick across furniture that hadn't been touched since the 19th century, and the faint scent of old wood and iron seemed to cling to every step. Rebecca moved slowly through the dim halls, her eyes catching on the strange harmony of objects left exactly as they had been. And then she stopped. An ornate wooden frame hung in the shadowed hallway, its glass clouded with age. Behind the glass, a family stared back at her. It was, at first glance, an ordinary portrait from the late 1800s. A father with a proud, distinguished mustache stood behind his seated wife. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, were arranged carefully around them. Everyone wore their Sunday best collars, stiff dresses pressed. At the bottom of the frame in fading ink, the year was written 1890. But Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't the people themselves, it was the photograph. Most pictures from that era were soft, grainy, dreamlike. This one was startlingly sharp. The texture of the wallpaper, the stitching on a sleeve, even the weave of the carpet seemed alive with impossible clarity. And the children. Their wide eyes held something she couldn't name. Their expressions weren't merely solemn, as Victorian children often appeared. There was a tension there, a quiet, breathless fear. Rebecca purchased the photograph along with a few other relics, unable to shake the pull it exerted. She told herself it was the remarkable detail, the craftsmanship. But some small part of her wondered if the photograph itself wanted to be found. Back in her Boston antique shop, Rebecca began the careful process of cleaning and restoring the image before offering it for sale. She gently lifted the backing from the frame, noticing immediately that the photograph was printed on paper unusually thick for its time. As she worked, she brought out her high-powered magnifying glass, a tool she'd used 1,000 times before. But this time, the closer she looked, the more uneasy she became. The family's posture was wrong. Victorian portraits required long, motionless exposures. Subjects sat stiff and still faces set in the heavy calm of waiting. Yet here there were tiny betrayals of movement. The mother's hand was slightly blurred as if trembling. The youngest child's gaze drifted off to the side, fixed on something or someone, just out of frame. And then Rebecca's breath caught. Behind the family, mounted on the parlor wall, hung a tall, ornate mirror. She leaned in, adjusting the magnifying glass. What should have been reflected, perhaps the photographer, the camera tripod, was not there. Instead, the mirror revealed a scene that did not match the room at all. In its glassy depth stood several dark, indistinct figures. They were not part of the family. They were not part of the room. Shadowy shapes clothed in black, their outlines barely visible, and in their hands, something long and thin. Ropes, restraints. Rebecca's fingers trembled against the magnifier. Was this photograph capturing a family at peace? or a family in the grip of something unspeakable, shaken. Rebecca reached for the phone. There was only one person she trusted with something this strange. Dr. James Harrison, historian of 19th century photography at Harvard, arrived at her shop the following morning. He listened carefully, skeptical but curious. Together they examined the image under professional equipment. The more he looked, the more serious his face became. "This is authentic," he finally said quietly. "The paper, the chemicals, the technique, it's all consistent with 1890. And the quality, it would have required one of the best photographers of the time." But the details unsettled him as much as they had unsettled her. The children's fine clothing, though expensive, bore signs of haste. Buttons, misaligned, hems uneven. The youngest girl's dress was wrinkled as if someone else had dressed her in a hurry. And on the father's wrists, barely visible, beneath the crisp cuffs, faint marks, thin and dark, like the traces left by rope. Dr. Harrison began to dig into the Whitmore name. What he found tightened the chill already crawling through the room. Edmund Whitmore, a wealthy textile manufacturer, had built his fortune during the roar of the Industrial Revolution. His wife, Catherine, came from an old Boston family. Together they had 3 children, Margaret 14, William 12, little Emma just 8 years old. The family moved into the Grand Salem mansion in 1885. And then silence. According to newspaper archives from October 1890, the entire Whitmore family vanished. No bodies, no note, no trail. Only this photograph remained. A portrait that may not have been a keepsake at all, but a record. A warning captured at the exact edge of terror. What do you see when you imagine that mirror were the figures behind the camera? Real or something else entirely? And if a photograph can hold a moment of fear for more than a century, what else might it be? Holding still. Their disappearance had once gripped the entire state of Massachusetts. In the autumn of 1890, the Whitmore family's vanishing filled the front pages of Boston's newspapers week after week. The grand house had been found unlocked, every door unlatched, every window intact. No signs of a struggle, no ransom notes, no footprints leading away into the wet October earth. It was as if the entire family had simply walked out of their lives and dissolved into the night air. No bodies were ever recovered. No witnesses ever came forward. And as the decades passed, the Whitmore mystery hardened into legend, a story whispered across Salem parlors and Boston tea rooms, a question that never found an answer. Armed with this history, Dr. James Harrison knew he couldn't stop at the photograph. He reached out to someone accustomed to peering into the cold spaces where history and crime overlap, Detective Sarah Chen, a specialist in unsolved cases with the Massachusetts State Police. Sarah had worked on several historical investigations before dusty records, faded ink, the quiet testimonies of the dead. But when she saw the photograph, when she heard Rebecca's trembling account of the mirror and the shadows, she agreed without hesitation to begin an unofficial inquiry. Her first step was to let technology speak. The photograph was scanned, enhanced, and analyzed by modern forensic experts, every pixel tested against the possibility of trick or accident. The results were not comforting. The figures in the mirror were no mere play of light. They were unmistakably human. Their blurred shapes showed depth movement. Arms extended, bodies angled as though restraining someone just beyond the camera's view. They were not reflections of furniture. They were there, standing in a place that should not exist, and there was more. Under specialized lighting, the wooden frame of the mirror revealed faint scratches, tiny lines almost invisible to the naked eye carved into the grain. When arranged under the right angle of illumination, the marks formed words. Two chilling, desperate words: help us. They had been etched carefully, deliberately, as if by a hand trying to send a final message across time. Forensic imaging also revealed something about the photograph itself. Unlike the long, careful exposures typical of Victorian portraiture, this image captured tiny micro-expressions: the flicker of fear, the tremor of a hand. It had been taken quickly under duress. The Whitmores were not posing for a keepsake. They were being documented in a moment of terror. Detective Chen began to construct a theory, one as disturbing as it was plausible. This was no family portrait. This was evidence. A photograph taken not by a proud father or a sentimental mother, but by someone who wished to record a crime in progress. A trophy. A warning. Her research led her deep into the brittle pages of 1890 court records and the ledgers of failing businesses. Piece by piece, a darker picture of Edmund Whitmore emerged. His once prosperous textile empire had been crumbling under the weight of labor strikes and mismanagement. Worse still, he had borrowed heavily from a shadowy network of investors' men with reputations steeped in violence, their money whispered to have ties to organized crime. Among the old estate files, Sarah unearthed a series of letters addressed to Edmund. The ink had faded, but the words were sharp with menace. Demands for repayment. Threats that grew more vicious with each exchange. One letter promised to make an example of the Whitmores if the debts were not returned. It read like a promise written in shadow. While combing through related business filings, Sarah discovered a name that made her pause: Marcus Crane. A professional photographer active in Boston during the late 1880s, Crane had been hired to document foreclosure proceedings across Massachusetts. His job was to photograph valuable assets before they were seized, a service prized by the very investors who now haunted Edmund's debt. And then, in late 1890, Marcus Crane vanished. He disappeared from Boston records in the same narrow window when the Whitmores themselves stepped off the map. The pieces began to settle into a shape too terrible to ignore. The photograph might not merely be evidence of a kidnapping. It might have been commissioned proof to other debtors that the threats were real, that payment was not merely requested, but demanded, at the cost of blood. The exceptional clarity of the image now made a dreadful kind of sense. This was the work of a professional forced to capture terror with precision. Marcus Crane had the skill and the equipment. Perhaps he also had no choice. Sarah dug deeper into the photographer's life. She found a man of talent and innovation, celebrated in Boston's art circles for his technical daring. But the celebration masked a more desperate story. Court documents showed multiple arrests for debt in 1889. Rumors linked Crane to men known for violence. Men who valued a photographer's eye not for art, but for intimidation. Letters preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society revealed the quiet panic of his wife written to her sister. She described a husband growing gaunt with fear, speaking of dangerous people, and jobs he could not refuse. One line trembling across the yellowed paper read simply, "Marcus says there are things he cannot unsee. Imagine him there, camera poised, heart racing, forced to capture the Whitmores in their final moments of freedom. His art turned into a weapon. His lens a silent witness to a crime that history would never solve. And somewhere perhaps, Marcus Crane vanished not to escape his debts, but to join the family he had been ordered to photograph, swallowed by the same darkness that still lingers quietly behind the glass of that impossible mirror. If you found a photograph like this, would you dare to keep it? Would you look closer or turn the frame face down and never lift it again? The final letter from Mrs. Crane carried a tremor that still seems to echo across the years. It was dated only days before her husband vanished. Her handwriting, small and hurried, told of a night filled with dread. Marcus came home last night, shaking and pale, she wrote. He said they've asked him to do something terrible, something that goes against everything he believes in. He's terrified, but he says he has no choice. I fear for our family if he refuses, but I fear for his soul if he complies. Those few sentences pierced through more than a century of silence. They suggested what investigators now dreaded to believe, that Marcus Crane, Boston's gifted photographer, had been forced to capture the Whitmore family during their captivity. The photograph's unsettling perfection, the sharpness, the impossible clarity suddenly felt sinister. It had been designed not as a keepsake, but as a warning. A record meant to survive, to whisper a threat to anyone who might one day fall into the same web. As Detective Sarah Chen pressed further into the cold corridors of the past, new fragments surfaced like bones in thawing ground. Property records revealed that in the final days before the Whitmores disappeared, the Salem mansion received unrecorded visitors, carriages arriving at odd hours, shadows moving across unlit windows. Neighbors long since gone had once reported faint cries drifting from the house at night, sounds dismissed at the time as imagination. A breakthrough came when modern scanning equipment uncovered a hidden compartment deep in the mansion's basement wall. Inside, preserved by dry air and darkness, lay the small belongings of the Whitmore children. A doll with a broken arm, a folded shawl still faintly scented of lavender, and a small leather diary belonging to 14-year-old Margaret Whitmore. The handwriting within began, steady, girlish. But as the pages neared October of 1890, the script trembled, the ink blotting under a fearful hand. Margaret described strange men visiting her father, threatening him, demanding money he did not have. For weeks, the family lived as prisoners in their own home, forbidden to leave, forbidden even to speak to neighbors. Her father grew desperate. Her mother wept in silence. The final entry, dated the very day the photograph was taken, was nearly unreadable words dragged across the page as if written in shaking candlelight. They came back today with the cameraman. Papa is crying. They made us dress up nice and said we have to smile for a picture. Mama says to be brave. I can hear them talking about what happens next. I'm scared we won't see another sunrise. If anyone finds this, please remember us as we were, not as they want us to look. Sarah set the diary down with hands that would not stop trembling. The truth was now undeniable. The photograph was not a family portrait at all. It was a death sentence captured on silvered paper. A record of a crime meant to frighten other debtors into obedience. Her investigation widened like a spreading stain. Old ledgers and forgotten legal filings revealed a hidden network of investors, men of wealth and ruthless ambition, who lent money behind the polite fronts of legitimate businesses. When debtors faltered, intimidation followed. And when intimidation failed, entire families vanished. Sarah uncovered at least 6 other households, each wealthy, each indebted, each erased from the map in the late 1800s. The pattern was chillingly precise. First came the letters of threat, then the isolation of the family, and finally, silence. Even more unsettling were the traces left behind. In several of the abandoned homes, hidden photographs surfaced family portraits, too perfect, too poised, preserved like trophies. Personal items had been deliberately left behind as if the perpetrators wanted their warnings to endure. The Whitmores, Sarah realized, were not an anomaly. They were one chapter in a secret campaign of fear that stretched across decades. A criminal enterprise cloaked in respectability, operated by men whose descendants would one day move easily through Boston's highest society. Photographers, lawyers, and businessmen formed its machinery. Professionals like Marcus Crane were forced to lend a veneer of legitimacy to acts of pure terror. The exceptional quality of the Whitmore photograph now made a cruel kind of sense. It was designed to last, to outlive newspapers and rumor, to whisper through time. This is what happens to those who defy us. Though more than 130 years had passed, Sarah felt a responsibility heavier than the years themselves. With the help of the district attorney's office, she prepared a meticulous report documenting the family's fate and the network that had consumed them. No indictments could be brought. Too many generations stood between the living and the dead. But exposure was its own form of reckoning. Several descendants of those early financiers quietly funded victims' rights organizations, perhaps in shame, perhaps in fear that the past was not as buried as they had believed. Sarah arranged for the Whitmore diary and the cursed photograph to be donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society. There, in climate-controlled silence, Margaret's final words rest in carefully lit display cases. A memorial service was held, distant relatives gathering to honor a family they had never known, but whose tragedy still ripples through their blood. Rebecca Martinez, the antique dealer whose careful eye had uncovered the photograph, refused any payment. "I could never sell something like this," she said softly. "It belongs to the truth now." Dr. Harrison published his research, the academic paper quickly becoming required reading in criminology courses. The Whitmore case proved how modern technology could unearth crimes thought forever lost, how even the faintest evidence, if preserved, might still speak. For Sarah, the work did not end. The forensic techniques developed for the Whitmore investigation were soon applied to other unsolved disappearances from the same era, unlocking more doors that history had tried to seal. A dedicated cold case unit for historical crimes was formed with Sarah as its first director. Rebecca, forever changed, began advocating for ethical practices in the antique trade. She worked with historians and law enforcement to ensure that objects carrying echoes of violence would be investigated, not sold as curiosities. And the photograph, once a curiosity, then a horror, became something else entirely, a testament to the quiet power of memory. A reminder that behind every artifact lies a human heartbeat. Sometimes faint, sometimes nearly forgotten, but never ever gone. Margaret Whitmore's last plea still lingers in the quiet of the archive. Remember us as we were, not as they want us to look. And now, because of a photograph rescued from the dust, we do. We remember a family's love, not just their terror. We remember the lives behind the silence. And perhaps, as you close your eyes tonight, you might wonder how many other portraits still hang in shadowed halls, waiting for someone brave enough to look a little closer.